It was just another day, until a sheriff's simple act of kindness would turn his entire world upside down. What he thought was just a puppy in need turned out to be something far more profound. Before I share what happened next, if you believe no one should ever face life's battles alone, and that dogs are our true heroes, please hit that subscribe button. Most people scroll past stories like this, but your one click could help this message reach someone who truly needs it. Sheriff Bill Turner had seen it all during his years of service. He dealt with the toughest criminals, the most dangerous situations, and the heartbreak that comes with the job. But when he lost his beloved dog, Buddy, it felt like a piece of him had been ripped away. For months, Bill couldn't escape the pain of that loss. It lingered, haunting his every step, that is, until one quiet afternoon, when he decided to visit the local animal shelter, an action that, at the time, seemed like nothing more than a distraction from the ache in his heart. Little did he know, this trip would change everything. It was the kind of day that felt like it had no beginning or end. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long, amber shadows across the small, weathered animal shelter on the edge of town. The day was slow, lethargic even, as if the world had hit the pause button. The air was still, thick with the kind of heat that you could almost taste. Bill Turner, sheriff of the small town, walked through the gates of the shelter without much thought. His boots clicked softly on the gravel pathway, a sound that was almost too loud in the quiet that surrounded him. Bill didn't know what had brought him here. He hadn't planned on coming, nor had he expected to stay for long. He had been driving around, lost in thought, when he found himself pulling into the parking lot of the shelter. He told himself he was just there to kill time, to give his mind a brief escape from the ache that had been gnawing at him for months. Inside the shelter, the scent of disinfectant hung heavily in the air, mixing with the faint odor of clean bedding and the dusty smell of aging walls. It was a familiar, sterile kind of scent, one that had long ago become a part of his routine during his brief visits to the shelter after Buddy had passed. He had lost count of the number of times he'd driven here in the last few months, walking through these same doors with a vague hope that somehow something would fill the hole left in his chest. But today felt different. Bill was acutely aware of the emptiness inside of him. It had been more than a few months since Buddy's death, but the grief still weighed him down. He had tried to move on, tried to get back to his old self, but it was as if that part of him, the part that could laugh, that could find joy in the little things, had died along with Buddy. The sudden silence in the shelter that day felt like a mirror to his own state of mind. The stillness, the quiet, the heaviness in the air, all of it matched his inner turmoil. As he walked through the doors, Bill couldn't help but notice the rows of cages that lined the walls of the shelter. Each one held a dog or a cat, and their eyes seemed to follow him, watching him as if they knew what he was searching for. Some of them barked, some of them mewed, and some just sat there, staring with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that seemed older than their years. It was a typical shelter scene, but as Bill walked further in, something caught his eye, something that made him stop dead in his tracks. In the farthest corner of the room, separated from the other animals, was a small cage, almost hidden in the shadows. The fur was matted, the cage old and rusted, and the puppy inside seemed so small and fragile. Bill's heart clenched. She was a pitiful sight. Her fur was tangled and unkempt, her body trembling with each breath. She wasn't barking or wagging her tail like the other dogs. She was still, too still, her brown eyes wide with uncertainty and fear. For a moment, Bill didn't move. His chest tightened, and an unexpected wave of emotion hit him hard. The grief, the loneliness, the ache of loss, it all surged back to the surface. The puppy, with her sad, pleading eyes, reminded him so much of Buddy. Her helplessness mirrored his own in a way that took him by surprise. But it wasn't just the puppy that caught Bill's attention. It was the way she seemed so distant, so disconnected from everything around her, as if she didn't belong in this world, as if she had forgotten what it meant to be loved or cared for. Bill swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. It reminded him of the way Buddy had looked when they first met, lost, abandoned, and uncertain. Bill's hand shook as he reached out to the cage, his fingers brushing against the cold metal bars. The puppy flinched at his touch, retreating further into the corner. Bill froze, feeling the sting of rejection. It was almost as though the puppy didn't trust him, didn't trust anyone, and that hit him harder than he expected. The shelter worker approached Bill, interrupting his moment of quiet reflection. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "That one's been here the longest," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor, as if she were ashamed. "No one's even come close to adopting her. She's just been here waiting." Bill nodded slowly, not quite sure how to respond. He could see the sadness in the worker's eyes, the way she spoke about the puppy as if she were a lost cause. And yet, Bill couldn't tear his eyes away from her. There was something about her that made his heart ache. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, or maybe it was the fact that no one had even bothered to give her a second glance. "She has a name?" Bill asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The worker hesitated before answering. "We just call her Scruffy. She came in about 6 months ago, but no one's shown any interest." Bill looked at the puppy again. Scruffy. The name seemed to suit her. She was scruffy in every sense of the word, but there was something more, something deeper than just her appearance, something in her eyes that pulled him in. He took a deep breath, trying to push aside the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm him. His thoughts drifted back to Buddy, the dog that had been his best friend for years. They had shared countless memories, from long hikes in the mountains to lazy afternoons on the couch. Buddy had always been there, a constant companion. Now, there was just the emptiness, the silence, and the grief that still clung to him like a second skin. Bill had tried to fill that emptiness in other ways. He had gone back to work, throwing himself into the routine of the job, hoping that the distraction would dull the pain. He had gone out with friends, tried to laugh, tried to forget, but nothing had worked. The hole left by Buddy's absence was still there, gnawing at him every day. And now, standing in front of this puppy, he realized something. He couldn't keep running from the pain. Maybe it wasn't about replacing Buddy. Maybe it was about finding a way to heal, to open his heart again, even if it meant risking more hurt. Bill stared down at Scruffy, her eyes still watching him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She was just a puppy, lost in a world that hadn't been kind to her. She had been abandoned, forgotten, just like he had felt so many times since Buddy was gone. Without another word, Bill took a step forward. The puppy didn't move, but she didn't back away either. Her gaze never wavered from his. Slowly, carefully, he reached into the cage, extending his hand toward her. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the most important one he had made in months. He needed this. She needed this. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the puppy took a cautious step forward, nuzzling her cold nose into the palm of his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a breakthrough, a connection, something that Bill hadn't felt in so long. And yet, there was something else, something strange, something unsettling. As he stood there, cradling the puppy's small, trembling body in his hands, he heard it, a bark. It was low, almost haunting, a bark that sounded nothing like the others. The other dogs had been barking frantically for attention, but this one was different. It came from deep inside the shelter, from a corner Bill hadn't noticed before. It was a deep, guttural sound, a bark that sent a shiver down his spine. Bill froze. His heart raced, his hand still resting gently on Scruffy's back. The bark echoed again, this time louder, and it was clear that it wasn't coming from one of the other dogs. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere darker. Bill turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shelter, but the space seemed empty, silent, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Bill's eyes flicked around the room, his senses alert. The sudden bark was out of place, strange. The other dogs had been barking nonstop ever since he'd walked through the door, eager for attention. But this bark, this one had a weight to it. It felt purposeful, almost like it was trying to convey something to him, something important. His hand remained on Scruffy's trembling body, feeling her heart thump under his palm. She wasn't reacting to the bark at all, still sitting quietly in his arms, staring at him with her wide, soulful eyes. But Bill couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shelter worker, who had been standing just a few feet away, looked at him with confusion in her eyes. "Did you hear that?" Bill asked, his voice unsteady. His own question startled him. The bark had shaken him more than he expected. The worker blinked, then glanced around the room. "Hear what, Sheriff? That bark. It didn't sound like the others. It sounded..." He paused, trying to find the right words. "It sounded different, like it was calling for something." The worker shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking around the shelter, as though she were looking for something, but finding nothing. "You must be hearing things. It's probably one of the other dogs. They can be loud sometimes." Bill shook his head. He didn't know why, but he was certain it hadn't come from one of the other dogs. The sound was too deep, too resonant, and it had felt like it was meant for him. It was as though the bark was a warning, an alert to something he couldn't yet understand. But before he could dwell on it any longer, the moment passed. The shelter returned to its usual hum. The dogs barked sporadically, a few paws tapping against their cages, but the atmosphere remained unchanged. Bill looked back down at Scruffy. Her eyes were still locked on his, her little body curled into his arms, and for a brief moment, he thought he could feel a connection, an unspoken understanding between them. This puppy, so small and fragile, seemed to understand the depths of his grief in a way no one else could. But even as he stood there, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The bark had unsettled him, and the worker's dismissive response only added to his growing sense of confusion. There was something more here, something about this shelter that didn't sit right. He could feel it. He looked around again, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. The shelter was small, a modest building with worn floors and aging cages. The windows were high and narrow, offering a glimpse of the sky outside. It was an old facility, one that had seen better days, but it was clear that the staff here did their best to care for the animals. Still, the atmosphere felt thick with something unspoken. The dogs seemed more desperate than usual, their eyes reflecting a kind of sadness that was impossible to ignore. And then, just as Bill was about to turn back to the worker, the bark came again. This time, it was louder, more forceful, echoing through the silence of the shelter. Bill stiffened, his muscles tensing as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He was certain now, it wasn't coming from one of the other dogs. This sound was coming from deep inside the shelter, somewhere hidden away. It felt deliberate, as if it were calling out to him. Without thinking, Bill's legs moved, carrying him toward the back of the shelter, his heart pounding in his chest. Scruffy whined softly in his arms, her tiny body trembling even more than before. It was as if she sensed the unease, too. Bill stopped briefly, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, he noticed the faint glint of something in her eyes. It was a look that spoke of survival, of something she had endured that Bill couldn't quite place. The worker, noticing Bill's movement, rushed to catch up. "Sheriff, where are you going?" I have to check something," Bill replied, his voice distant. His instincts were pulling him deeper into the shelter, leading him toward the source of the strange bark. As he walked, the air grew heavier. The shelter seemed darker now, the shadows creeping in from the corners of the room. The dogs in their cages still barked, but now there was a tension in the air, something tangible. Bill couldn't put his finger on it, but it felt like the shelter itself was holding its breath. He passed rows of cages, each one filled with animals that had seen too much, endured too much. Some of the dogs looked hopeful, their tails wagging as they pressed their faces against the bars. Others, like Scruffy, seemed resigned to their fate, their eyes distant and clouded. As Bill moved toward the back of the shelter, the barking grew louder. It echoed down the narrow hallway, each sound reverberating in his chest. He could almost feel it in the pit of his stomach, a kind of foreboding that tugged at him. When he reached the end of the hallway, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, at the very back of the shelter, was a door, one he had never noticed before. It was old and weathered, its wood worn and cracked. A sign above it read "Staff Only," but there was something about it that made Bill feel like he had to go inside. His instinct screamed at him to open it, to discover what was on the other side. But something else, something deeper, told him that whatever lay behind that door was not meant to be found. His hand hovered over the handle for a moment, his mind racing. He glanced back at Scruffy, still cradled in his arms. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with what Bill could only describe as concern. For a brief moment, Bill wondered if she, too, felt the pull of the unknown. Taking a deep breath, he turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. It was a small, cramped space, filled with boxes and clutter. But as Bill stepped inside, his eyes landed on something that made his heart stop. In the corner of the room, there was another cage. But this one was different. It wasn't a typical animal cage. It was large, reinforced with steel bars, and it looked as though it had been built to hold something much bigger than a dog or a cat. Inside, Bill saw a shadow, something large and dark, something that made his blood run cold. It was hard to make out at first, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he could see it more clearly. A large German shepherd, standing motionless, its eyes locked on him, the same eyes that had been watching him through the shelter, eyes that seemed to recognize him, eyes that seemed familiar. Bill's heart raced, his breath coming in quick bursts. This was no coincidence. This dog, this German shepherd, had been the one barking, the one that had called out to him. But why? The dog let out another low growl, and Bill froze. There was something in its gaze, something that Bill couldn't explain. It was as if the dog knew him. It was as if the dog had been waiting for him. The room was thick with an unsettling stillness. The German shepherd stood frozen in place, its dark eyes never leaving Bill. The low growl rumbled from deep within its chest, almost a warning. It wasn't a normal dog sound. There was a depth to it, a sense of purpose. The bark that had echoed earlier suddenly made sense. This was the dog who had been calling to him. But why? Bill took a slow step forward, his boots tapping softly on the wooden floor. The German Shepherd didn't flinch, but the tension in the room increased. His hand instinctively tightened around the little puppy, still nestled in his arms. Scruffy, who had been calm moments before, began to squirm, her body tense and alert. Her small, trembling frame only added to the strange energy that seemed to be filling the room. The growl deepened, a sound that vibrated in Bill's bones. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it was primal, like the dog was trying to communicate something far more urgent than just a desire for attention. Bill's gaze flickered around the room, the dim light making it difficult to see much. The shelves were stacked with crates, boxes, and discarded supplies, but it was the cage that had captured his attention. Unlike the others, this one wasn't just used to house a dog. It was built with heavy-duty steel bars, far stronger than anything you'd see in a typical shelter. Bill could tell it wasn't meant for just any animal. This was a cage designed to hold something else, something stronger, something different. His eyes returned to the shepherd, still locked in place, staring him down. There was a strange recognition in its eyes, a sense that this was no random encounter. Bill couldn't shake the feeling that he had been here before, that somehow, in some way, this dog knew him. He took another step forward, his instincts driving him to uncover the truth. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the dog let out a soft, almost mournful whine. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect from a trained police dog, or even a stray. This sound was one of sorrow, of desperation. It was as if the dog were pleading with him, begging him to understand. Bill's heart raced. What the hell was going on here? The air in the room was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The sound of Scruffy's soft whimper in his arms broke the silence, grounding Bill for a moment. He looked down at her, her small face pressed against his chest. She seemed so out of place in this eerie setting, so fragile, so full of innocence. And yet, Bill knew that there was something more to this. The feeling gnawed at him, a sensation in his gut that this shelter, this place, wasn't just home to animals in need. There was something darker here, something hidden in the shadows, and Bill was determined to uncover it. With a deep breath, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "What's going on here?" The question was directed not at the dog, but at the air around him, at the very room itself. But before he could think further, the German Shepherd's growl softened, and then it did something that stopped Bill dead in his tracks. The dog stood, its large body shifting, and then it slowly sat down, its eyes never leaving Bill's. The once aggressive energy had changed, replaced by a strange, almost submissive calm. Bill took another cautious step forward. The movement seemed to trigger something in the dog, as it stood again, its eyes never breaking the connection. And then, as if on cue, the dog turned its head to the side, its gaze shifting toward the far corner of the room. It was as though it was silently telling Bill to look. Bill followed its gaze, his breath catching in his throat. In the corner, hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a small, dusty wooden box. It was barely visible, tucked away, so that it was almost as if it were deliberately concealed. But there was something about it, a feeling that pressed against Bill's chest, urging him to approach it. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to move. With cautious steps, he made his way toward the corner. As he bent down to reach for the box, the German Shepherd's eyes never left him. Scruffy, still cradled in his arms, seemed to sense something too. She started to growl, her tiny form quivering in his arms. It was as though she too recognized that this was no ordinary situation. Bill's fingers brushed against the old wooden box. It was heavier than he expected, its surface rough and worn. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he might find, but something deep inside told him that this was the moment when everything would change. He lifted the box carefully. As soon as he did, a loud, metallic clink echoed through the room. Bill froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The box, now fully in his hands, had revealed a small metal lock, rusted over with age. It was locked shut, sealed away, as if whatever was inside had been hidden for a reason. Bill's hand hovered over the lock, his mind racing. Should he open it? Was it safe to? He glanced back at the German Shepherd, whose gaze was fixed on him with an intensity that made Bill's heart race. This wasn't just a dog. It was like the animal was urging him to do something, to uncover whatever had been kept hidden in this box. With a shaky breath, Bill reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. His hands were trembling as he used the blade to pry at the rusted lock. The metal gave way with a loud snap, and the box opened with a heavy creak. Bill's pulse quickened as he peered inside. The box contained something small, wrapped in what appeared to be an old, faded cloth. Slowly, he unwrapped it, revealing a weathered photograph. The image was black and white, its edges frayed from age. Bill's eyes scanned the photo, then widened in shock. It was a picture of him. He blinked, his breath catching in his throat. There was no mistake. The man in the photograph was unmistakably him, young, perhaps in his 20s, wearing the same sheriff uniform he wore now. But what made it even stranger was that he was standing next to the German Shepherd. The dog, unmistakable in its eyes and build, was there beside him, just as it had been in the shelter. Bill's mind reeled. How could this be possible? Why did this dog look so familiar? Why was he in this photo, with an animal he had never met before? Suddenly, a voice broke through his thoughts, a voice he hadn't expected to hear. "You found it." Bill turned quickly, his hand still clutching the photograph. The worker from the shelter was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. I didn't think anyone would ever find it," she whispered. Bill's stomach sank. "Find what?" The worker hesitated, then stepped into the room. "The dog in the photo. There's something you need to know." Slowly, carefully, he reached into the cage, extending his hand toward her. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the most important one he had made in months. He needed this. She needed this. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the puppy took a cautious step forward, nuzzling her cold nose into the palm of his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a breakthrough, a connection, something that Bill hadn't felt in so long. And yet, there was something else, something strange, something unsettling. As he stood there, cradling the puppy's small, trembling body in his hands, he heard it, a bark. It was low, almost haunting, a bark that sounded nothing like the others. The other dogs had been barking frantically for attention, but this one was different. It came from deep inside the shelter, from a corner Bill hadn't noticed before. It was a deep, guttural sound, a bark that sent a shiver down his spine. Bill froze. His heart raced, his hand still resting gently on Scruffy's back. The bark echoed again, this time louder, and it was clear that it wasn't coming from one of the other dogs. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere darker. Bill turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shelter, but the space seemed empty, silent, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Bill's eyes flicked around the room, his senses alert. The sudden bark was out of place, strange. The other dogs had been barking nonstop ever since he'd walked through the door, eager for attention. But this bark, this one had a weight to it. It felt purposeful, almost like it was trying to convey something to him, something important. His hand remained on Scruffy's trembling body, feeling her heart thump under his palm. She wasn't reacting to the bark at all, still sitting quietly in his arms, staring at him with her wide, soulful eyes. But Bill couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shelter worker, who had been standing just a few feet away, looked at him with confusion in her eyes. "Did you hear that?" Bill asked, his voice unsteady. His own question startled him. The bark had shaken him more than he expected. The worker blinked, then glanced around the room. "Hear what, Sheriff?" "That bark. It didn't sound like the others. It sounded..." He paused, trying to find the right words. "It sounded different, like it was calling for something." The worker shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking around the shelter, as though she were looking for something, but finding nothing. "You must be hearing things. It's probably one of the other dogs. They can be loud sometimes." Bill shook his head. He didn't know why, but he was certain it hadn't come from one of the other dogs. The sound was too deep, too resonant, and it had felt like it was meant for him. It was as though the bark was a warning, an alert to something he couldn't yet understand. But before he could dwell on it any longer, the moment passed. The shelter returned to its usual hum. The dogs barked sporadically, a few paws tapping against their cages, but the atmosphere remained unchanged. Bill looked back down at Scruffy. Her eyes were still locked on his, her little body curled into his arms, and for a brief moment, he thought he could feel a connection, an unspoken understanding between them. This puppy, so small and fragile, seemed to understand the depths of his grief in a way no one else could. But even as he stood there, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The bark had unsettled him, and the worker's dismissive response only added to his growing sense of confusion. There was something more here, something about this shelter that didn't sit right. He could feel it. He looked around again, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. The shelter was small, a modest building with worn floors and aging cages. The windows were high and narrow, offering a glimpse of the sky outside. It was an old facility, one that had seen better days, but it was clear that the staff here did their best to care for the animals. Still, the atmosphere felt thick with something unspoken. The dogs seemed more desperate than usual, their eyes reflecting a kind of sadness that was impossible to ignore. And then, just as Bill was about to turn back to the worker, the bark came again. This time, it was louder, more forceful, echoing through the silence of the shelter. Bill stiffened, his muscles tensing as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He was certain now, it wasn't coming from one of the other dogs. This sound was coming from deep inside the shelter, somewhere hidden away. It felt deliberate, as if it were calling out to him. Without thinking, Bill's legs moved, carrying him toward the back of the shelter, his heart pounding in his chest. Scruffy whined softly in his arms, her tiny body trembling even more than before. It was as if she sensed the unease, too. Bill stopped briefly, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, he noticed a faint glint of something in her eyes. It was a look that spoke of survival, of something she had endured that Bill couldn't quite place. The worker, noticing Bill's movement, rushed to catch up. "Sheriff, where are you going?" I have to check something," Bill replied, his voice distant. His instincts were pulling him deeper into the shelter, leading him toward the source of the strange bark. As he walked, the air grew heavier. The shelter seemed darker now, the shadows creeping in from the corners of the room. The dogs in their cages still barked, but now there was a tension in the air, something tangible. Bill couldn't put his finger on it, but it felt like the shelter itself was holding its breath. He passed rows of cages, each one filled with animals that had seen too much, endured too much. Some of the dogs looked hopeful, their tails wagging as they pressed their faces against the bars. Others, like Scruffy, seemed resigned to their fate, their eyes distant and clouded. As Bill moved toward the back of the shelter, the barking grew louder. It echoed down the narrow hallway, each sound reverberating in his chest. He could almost feel it in the pit of his stomach, a kind of foreboding that tugged at him. When he reached the end of the hallway, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, at the very back of the shelter, was a door, one he had never noticed before. It was old and weathered, its wood worn and cracked. A sign above it read "Staff Only," but there was something about it that made Bill feel like he had to go inside. His instincts screamed at him to open it, to discover what was on the other side. But something else, something deeper, told him that whatever lay behind that door was not meant to be found. His hand hovered over the handle for a moment, his mind racing. He glanced back at Scruffy, still cradled in his arms. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with what Bill could only describe as concern. For a brief moment, Bill wondered if she, too, felt the pull of the unknown. Taking a deep breath, he turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. It was a small, cramped space, filled with boxes and clutter. But as Bill stepped inside, his eyes landed on something that made his heart stop. In the corner of the room, there was another cage. But this one was different. It wasn't a typical animal cage. It was large, reinforced with steel bars, and it looked as though it had been built to hold something much bigger than a dog or a cat. The German shepherd let out a low, steady bark, one that seemed to call out to Bill, urging him to face the truth. And in that moment, Bill knew that his life was about to change forever. Bill's thoughts were like a tangled mess, threads of his life unraveling with each word the worker spoke. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls of the shelter were closing in on him. His mind was racing, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't catch up to the truth. The woman's revelation that Scout wasn't just any dog, that he had once been Bill's partner, left him with more questions than answers. He turned the photograph over in his hand, the edges of the paper feeling brittle, as if they might disintegrate under the weight of the secrets it held. How could it be true? The man in the photo was him, but younger, a version of himself he had no memory of. And the dog, that was Scout. Bill's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the implications. Everything in his life, the life he had known, had been built on a foundation of lies. "What do you mean by they?" Bill's voice was shaky as he asked, his eyes still glued to the photograph. "Who erased my memories? Who was I working for?" The worker took a deep breath and looked toward the door as though she feared someone might be listening. "You were part of an organization that the public never knew about," she said in a low voice, her eyes darting nervously. "It was a covert agency, tasked with handling unusual situations, things that couldn't be explained, things that had to be kept hidden. You and Scout were at the center of it." Bill's mind was spinning. Unusual situations? What are you talking about? Was this a government agency? A private group? The worker hesitated before responding. It wasn't exactly government. It wasn't a regular agency. It was something more secretive. It wasn't supposed to exist at all. They called it the archive. It was created to deal with phenomena and events that were too dangerous for the public to know about. And you, she stopped, looking him dead in the eyes. You were one of their best operatives. You and Scout worked together on cases that no one else could handle. You uncovered things that most people wouldn't even believe. Bill's mind was still trying to process the words. What kind of things? What were we dealing with? People who had abilities, the worker said, her voice dropping even lower. There were people out there who weren't normal. Some had powers. Others were involved in strange occurrences, and the archive was created to monitor and contain them. But you and Scout, you didn't just handle cases. You uncovered the truth behind it all, the truth that they didn't want anyone to know. Bill took a step back, his mind reeling with this new information. Abilities? What are you talking about? Powers? This sounds insane. The worker looked down, her face pale. I know it sounds unbelievable, but you have to understand, Bill. This wasn't just about protecting people. It was about controlling power. The archive was run by a group of people who wanted to use the abilities of others for their own gain. They needed operatives like you, people they could trust, to make sure their secrets stayed hidden. Bill ran a hand through his hair, his breath coming in shallow bursts. And Scout, he was part of all of this. The question slipped out before he could stop it. He was still trying to make sense of how this German shepherd, who was now sitting calmly at his feet, had played such a pivotal role in a life he couldn't remember. The worker nodded slowly. Scout wasn't just a dog. He was part of an experiment. They used animals in ways they never should have. But Scout, he was different. They trained him to work with you, to be your partner in the field. He had abilities too. He wasn't just an ordinary dog. Bill's mind was swirling. Abilities? Scout, his partner? The very idea seemed impossible. Yet here he was, standing in front of a dog who, according to the worker, had once been his closest ally in a world he no longer remembered. His life, his entire identity, was being called into question, piece by piece. Why don't I remember any of this? Bill whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Why did they erase my memories? The worker's face tightened with guilt. They had to. The things you uncovered, the people you uncovered, they were too dangerous. The archive wasn't just protecting the public. It was hiding things that could destroy everything. They had to make sure you didn't remember too much, or you'd become a liability. But I've always been a sheriff, Bill said, his voice trembling with confusion. I've been here in this town. How could I forget all of this? You've been here, yes, the worker replied softly, but not because you chose to be. You were placed here. After everything ended, after the work with the archive stopped, you were given a new life. They erased your memories, wiped your mind clean, and set you back here to live a normal life. You were supposed to forget everything. Forget who you were. Forget the people you worked for. Forget Scout. Bill's mind reeled with disbelief. He had spent years believing that his life was just a simple, straightforward one. A sheriff in a small town, a man who loved his dog Buddy. There had been nothing remarkable about his life. But now it felt as though everything had been a carefully constructed illusion. His past had been hidden from him, and worse, it had been buried so deep that he had no idea what he had been a part of. He turned to the German shepherd, Scout, who had remained eerily silent throughout the conversation. The dog was no longer growling, but his eyes still held a knowing look. It was as though he was waiting for Bill to remember something, waiting for Bill to connect the dots. Bill dropped his gaze to the photograph once more, his hands trembling as he looked at the version of himself in the image. The man was smiling, youthful, full of life, so different from the man he was now. The man in the photograph had been someone else, someone who had a purpose, someone who had a partner in Scout, a dog with abilities, a dog who had been by his side through it all. The worker seemed to sense Bill's growing confusion. Bill, she said, her voice gentle, the truth is, they didn't just erase your memories, they changed you. The work you did with Scout, it changed you. And now, for reasons I don't fully understand, it's all coming back. The past is trying to break through, and you have to remember, Sheriff. You have to remember who you were, and why Scout is here. Bill swallowed hard. The world around him felt like it was collapsing, the very fabric of his life coming undone. And yet, despite everything, he knew one thing. This wasn't just about his past. It was about something much bigger, something that had been kept hidden for years, and now it was beginning to surface. The silence that followed was thick with uncertainty. Bill finally turned his eyes back to Scout. What do you want me to remember, old friend? He whispered, as though speaking directly to the dog. The German shepherd's gaze softened, and for the first time since Bill had entered the shelter, Scout moved. He stood up slowly, stretching his legs before walking over to Bill. The dog lowered his head, nudging the photograph gently with his nose. Bill bent down, heart racing, and picked it up once more. As he held the photo in his hand, a strange sensation filled him, something stirring deep inside his chest, something that felt like a long-forgotten memory beginning to surface. His breath hitched as the world around him seemed to tilt, the room growing even quieter. And in that moment, something clicked. Bill stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, still clutching the photograph that had begun to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. His hands were shaking, his mind racing. He had been given a new life, a new identity, but everything he thought was real was now tainted with lies. The small-town sheriff he had become was just a shadow of the man he used to be, a man who had fought battles, uncovered truths, and formed an unbreakable bond with a dog, Scout. Bill looked down at the German Shepherd, the dog who had been his partner, his confidant, all those years ago. Scout's eyes met his, the unspoken connection between them undeniable. The dog wasn't just here to remind Bill of his forgotten past. Scout was here because something wasn't finished. Something was still unresolved. The worker stood off to the side, her presence heavy in the room. Bill could see the guilt in her eyes as she watched him process the avalanche of truths he was being forced to confront. She had been hiding things from him, things that would change the course of his life. But now, as the weight of his past started to make sense, there was no turning back. Bill couldn't ignore what was happening. He couldn't ignore Scout, the photo, or the strange pull he felt toward a world he had once known. Why now? Why has everything started to resurface? Bill's voice was low, almost a whisper. It felt as though the air had thickened around him, choking him with the enormity of what was happening. The pieces of his past were clicking together, but he wasn't sure he was ready to accept them. The worker's face tightened. She looked like she was struggling to find the right words. "You're being watched," she said softly, her voice trembling. "The people who erased your memories, they're still out there. And now that you've begun to remember, they won't stop until they make sure you forget everything again. They don't want you to remember what happened, Sheriff. They're afraid of what you know." Bill's blood ran cold. Who are they? Who's trying to stop me from remembering? The worker looked away, a pained expression crossing her face. "It's not a simple answer, Bill. These people, they're powerful, more than you could ever imagine. They're the ones behind the archive. They control everything, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets buried. If you dig too deep, if you uncover too much, they'll come for you." Bill felt a knot form in his stomach. He had thought his biggest struggle had been losing Buddy, the dog who had been his constant companion through thick and thin. But now, as the truth began to unfold, he realized that his fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. He looked down at the German Shepherd, whose eyes were still locked on him. "What do I do now, Scout?" Bill asked, his voice hoarse. He knew, deep down, that this was no longer about solving a mystery. This was about survival, his survival. The dog stood silently, then, with a sudden burst of energy, bounded toward the back of the room. Bill's pulse quickened as he followed Scout, unsure of what the dog was leading him to now. The worker didn't follow. She stayed behind, watching them with a mixture of caution and fear. Scout stopped in front of the small metal door at the back of the shelter, the one that Bill had noticed earlier but hadn't dared to open, the door that had led him into the hidden room where he had discovered the photograph, the door that now seemed like the key to unlocking everything. Bill's heart thudded as he reached for the handle. This wasn't just a door. It was a threshold, a barrier between the life he had known and the one he was about to be pulled back into. He could feel it. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. "Scout," Bill whispered, his hand hovering over the door. "This is it, isn't it? This is where it all started." The dog let out a low bark, as if urging him to open it. Bill turned the handle, and the door creaked open with a groan, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. It was the same room Bill had discovered before, the one with the large steel cage, the one that had unsettled him with its mystery. But this time, something was different. The room felt alive, charged with energy. As Bill stepped inside, the air seemed to change. It felt heavier, more oppressive. Scout was already inside, standing next to the large cage, his ears perked up, his body tense. Bill's gaze followed the dog's, and his heart skipped a beat. The cage was empty, but that wasn't what caught Bill's attention. It was what had been left behind. On the floor, just beside the cage, a set of files, thick and sealed with a red stamp that read "Confidential." Bill bent down slowly, his fingers trembling as he picked up the files. His eyes scanned the cover, and the words burned into his mind. Project Eclipse. It was the name of the operation that the archive had been running. But this wasn't just any operation. It was the operation that Bill had been a part of. the one he had helped uncover, the one that had made him a threat in the eyes of those who had erased his memories. He opened the first file and found himself staring at a list of names he didn't recognize, but that seemed to stir something deep inside him. He turned the page, his breath quickening, and then his eyes froze on a single line. Agent Bill Turner, Subject 11. His name. He was listed as a subject in the archive's files, but the next line made his blood run cold. Lost to memory wipe, containment breach. Bill's heart slammed against his chest as the truth hit him like a freight train. He hadn't just been erased, he had been taken. He had been a part of something so dangerous, so volatile, that they had to remove him from the equation. They had to make him forget. They had to keep him away from the truth at all costs. And now, he was about to uncover everything. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise from the hallway. A door slammed open, followed by footsteps. Too many footsteps. Bill's body tensed as he turned to Scout, who was now growling softly, his eyes focused on the door. "They found us," the worker whispered, panic flooding her voice. She backed away from the door, her hands raised in a pleading gesture. "You have to go, Sheriff. You have to get out of here before they..." Before she could finish, the sound of heavy boots echoed from outside the room, growing louder, closer. Bill's instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly to the file cabinet, shoving the documents inside his jacket. "Scout," Bill murmured, the urgency in his voice clear. "We're not going anywhere without answers." The German shepherd let out a bark, his eyes flashing with a knowing intensity. It was as though he understood what was coming next. The past had caught up to them both, and now there was no running from it. Bill turned toward the door just as it flew open, and two men in black tactical gear rushed in, their faces hidden behind dark masks. One of them pointed a gun at Bill, and his voice was cold and steady. "Sheriff Turner, we've been looking for you." Bill's breath hitched as the men stepped forward, their weapons trained on him. But Scout was already moving. With a powerful leap, he lunged at the nearest man, knocking him to the ground with a snarl. The second man reacted quickly, but Bill was faster. He reached for his sidearm, drawing it from his holster in one fluid motion. He wasn't going to let them erase him again. Not this time. The fight had just begun. The room was chaos. The harsh glow of overhead lights flickered as Bill's hand instinctively reached for his weapon. The tactical agents in black gear were closing in, their movements swift, practiced. The first man on the ground struggled, but Scout wasn't giving him any chance to recover. With the force of a freight train, the German shepherd pinned the man down, teeth bared, eyes blazing with raw power and fury. Bill didn't hesitate. He fired 2 shots in quick succession, the sound of the gunshots deafening in the small room. The first agent, who had been standing by the doorway, dropped to the ground with a grunt, his weapon clattering across the concrete floor. But the second agent, the one who'd aimed at Bill, wasn't so easily deterred. He raised his weapon, but Bill was already moving. With his years of training kicking in, Bill dove behind the filing cabinet, just as a volley of bullets tore through the air, grazing the edge of the metal. He pulled himself low, heart pounding as his mind worked at lightning speed. The agent was trying to outflank him. He was going to take the high ground, but Bill had been in situations like this before. He wasn't about to be cornered. "Scout, stay low," Bill shouted as he made a quick decision. His dog, the one who had been his partner all those years ago, seemed to understand the command without hesitation. Scout darted behind a nearby metal shelf, his body low and poised for attack. The agent didn't seem to see him coming. Bill's mind raced, and in a split second, he made his move. He crawled forward, keeping low to the ground, the scent of cold metal and gunpowder filling his nose. The agent moved further into the room, confident, cocky, too cocky. Bill could see him now, standing just behind a stack of crates. He had the high ground, but Bill had something he didn't: experience. Bill rolled to the side, popping up in one smooth motion as he aimed his weapon directly at the agent. The man didn't even have time to react before Bill squeezed the trigger, the bullet finding its mark. The agent crumpled, his weapon slipping from his hand and landing with a soft thud on the floor. For a moment, everything was still. The silence of the room felt suffocating. The only sound Bill could hear was his own breathing, ragged and uneven from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Scout was beside him in an instant, standing tall and ready for whatever came next, his eyes sharp, scanning the room for any sign of danger. Bill turned toward the worker, whose face was ghostly pale. She had been standing off to the side, a helpless bystander to the chaos unfolding in front of her. She looked from Bill to the agents on the floor and back to Bill, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just witnessed. "Get out of here," Bill commanded, his voice low but firm. "Now." "You're not safe here anymore." The worker nodded, her face a mask of fear and uncertainty, but she didn't argue. Without another word, she bolted for the door, glancing back only once at Bill and Scout. Bill didn't have time to watch her leave. There were more agents coming, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they came for. Bill's eyes flicked toward the door. The sound of boots echoed from down the hallway, the heavy footsteps drawing nearer. More men, more danger. His body tensed in preparation. The archive wasn't going to give up. They would keep coming until he was silenced for good. Scout growled low in his throat, his body coiled, ready to spring. Bill knew the dog wasn't just a loyal companion anymore. Scout had been trained for this, trained for situations like this, where the stakes were life and death. Bill turned to his partner, his eyes locking with Scout's. They had been through hell together in the past, and now they were facing it again. "Let's finish this," Bill muttered, his voice grim. The footsteps grew louder. Bill could see shadows moving just outside the door, the faint outline of figures in black approaching. There were at least 3 more men coming. He needed to think fast, and as his eyes darted around the room, he saw the solution. The back exit. It was close, but there was no way out without a fight. "Scout, get ready," Bill whispered, his finger twitching over the trigger. As if on cue, the door slammed open, and 2 more agents stormed in, guns raised. Bill didn't hesitate. He fired 2 shots in quick succession, the sound of the bullets ringing in the air. The first agent dropped, the second ducking just in time to avoid the line of fire. But that was enough. Bill moved quickly, taking advantage of the opening. He dashed across the room, his gun drawn, his heart pounding in his chest. Scout followed closely, darting around the corner to flank the agent who had taken cover behind a metal crate. The agent never saw it coming. In a blur of motion, Scout lunged, his powerful jaws locking around the agent's arm and pulling him to the ground. The man screamed in pain, but Scout didn't let go. The German Shepherd had been trained to hold until the job was done. Bill had no time to watch. He was already making his way toward the exit, his mind calculating his every move. He could hear the agents outside, their voices, muffled and panicked, as they tried to regroup. But Bill and Scout weren't giving them a chance. "Come on," Bill urged the dog, his voice sharp and commanding. The 2 made their way through the back corridors of the shelter, moving swiftly but quietly. They had no intention of being caught. Bill's mind was focused entirely on the next step, escape. He wasn't going to die here, not like this. Just as Bill reached the back door, he turned one last time to look behind him. The shelter was now filled with chaos, gunshots, screams, and the unmistakable sounds of a fight for survival. But Bill wasn't going to be a part of it anymore, not if he could help it. With a final push, he kicked the back door open and stepped outside into the cold night air. The parking lot was empty. No cars, no help. Scout was at his side, breathing heavily, but unwavering. Together, they ran, disappearing into the shadows of the night, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance, drawing closer. They were alive, but the real fight was just beginning. The cold night air hit Bill's face as he and Scout sprinted across the darkened parking lot. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind them, the sound of sirens was growing louder, and the distant rumble of approaching vehicles told him one thing: he wasn't safe. They were coming for him. Bill's mind raced. He had escaped the shelter, but for how long? The archive had made sure that nothing was left to chance. They would be hunting him down now, and he couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. He glanced at Scout, whose fur glistened in the dim light, his steady gaze locked ahead. The dog was more than a partner now. He was Bill's only ally in this war, the one constant in a world that had been turned upside down. Bill's breath was sharp and ragged as he pulled out his phone, the screen flashing as he navigated through his contacts. His fingers were slick with sweat, but he managed to dial a number he hadn't called in years. A friend from his past, someone he hadn't spoken to since before he'd lost his memories. The phone rang twice before it was picked up. "Bill, is that you?" The voice on the other end was gravelly, laced with disbelief. "I thought you were dead." "I'm alive," Bill replied, his voice low. "But not for long. They're coming for me. I need help, now." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then a sharp exhale. "Where are you?" "I'll send someone to meet you." "Meet me at the old cabin," Bill said, his mind already mapping out his next move. "The one by the lake. You know the place. I'll be there." "Stay alive, Bill." The call ended, and Bill slipped the phone back into his pocket, his mind already planning the next steps. The cabin by the lake was secluded, a place where he could regroup, think, and hopefully lay low for a while. but the urgency of his situation was impossible to ignore. The archive wasn't going to let him disappear so easily. They had erased him once, and now they would stop at nothing to do it again. "Come on, Scout," Bill whispered, looking down at his dog. "We've got to move fast." Scout barked in response, his tail wagging once before he bolted forward, his body moving with precision. Bill followed, his footsteps muffled against the soft earth. The two of them were like ghosts now, blending into the shadows, trying to disappear before the enemy could catch up. As they neared the cabin, Bill's thoughts were a whirlwind of questions. What had happened to his past? What had he done that was so dangerous that the archive felt the need to erase his memories? And why had Scout been left behind? Bill knew deep down that the dog had more to do with all of this than he realized. The cabin came into view, a solitary structure nestled against the edge of the forest, its roof weathered by time. It was quiet here, the only sounds being the rustling of the trees and the distant howl of an animal. It was a place Bill had once called home, a place where he'd gone to escape from the chaos of the world. But now, it felt more like a prison. He pushed open the creaking door, and Scout bounded inside ahead of him. Bill followed, the familiar scent of pine and old wood hitting him immediately. There was a warmth to the cabin that made it feel like a refuge, but he knew it wouldn't last. Not with the archive on his tail. He moved quickly to the small table in the corner of the room, spreading the files from the archive across it. His hands trembled as he looked over the documents, his mind absorbing the information he'd uncovered. Project Eclipse, the names on the list, his own name, labeled as Subject 11, lost to a memory wipe. The truth was darker than anything he could have imagined. Bill had been part of an operation that sought to manipulate people with extraordinary abilities. He had uncovered something powerful, and that's when everything had changed. That's when they had erased him, and now they were coming to finish the job. "Bill," a voice called from the doorway, interrupting his thoughts. Bill turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but he relaxed when he saw who it was. A man in his mid-40s, grizzled and rough around the edges, stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Bill. "Tom," Bill said, his voice low but filled with relief. "I didn't think you'd come." Tom grinned, his eyes filled with the same old mischief. "You should know better than that, Bill. I'm not one to leave a friend hanging. Besides, we've got unfinished business, don't we?" Bill nodded, stepping away from the table. He hadn't seen Tom in years, but they had been close once, partners, in a sense, back in the days when he worked for the archive. Tom was one of the few people who had known the truth about Bill's past. "I need answers, Tom," Bill said, his voice heavy. "I need to know what happened, what I was a part of." Tom's expression hardened. "I figured you'd remember eventually. You weren't meant to, but the memories, they come back, one piece at a time. You were part of something much bigger than you realized, Bill. The archive's goals weren't just about controlling abilities. They were about controlling people like you, people who could uncover the truth and expose them for what they really were." Bill's mind raced. He had always known there was something off about the archive, but to hear Tom confirm it, to understand the magnitude of what had been done to him, it made him sick to his stomach. "They erased me," Bill said quietly, the weight of the words finally settling in. "And they did it to protect themselves, to keep me from remembering the truth." "Exactly," Tom said, his voice grim. "But now you've remembered, and that's why they're coming for you. You're a threat to everything they've built. You've always been a threat, Bill." Bill ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "What do I do now? How do I stop them?" Tom hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer to Bill. "You can't stop them alone, but together, we can take them down. We'll expose them for what they are. We'll make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Bill's eyes flicked to the files scattered on the table, the truth staring back at him. Scout stood by his side, his tail still. Bill could feel the weight of his past bearing down on him, but in that moment, something clicked. He wasn't going to let the archive control him anymore. He wasn't going to be erased again. He turned to Tom, his voice resolute. "Let's finish this." The two men stood there in the dim light of the cabin, knowing that their fight was far from over. The archive had tried to bury the truth. They had tried to erase it, but Bill and Scout were still here, still standing, and they would stop at nothing to uncover the full extent of the lies they had been told. The battle for Bill's freedom and the truth had only just begun. As Bill and Scout stood in the quiet cabin, the weight of their choices hung heavily in the air. The storm outside had subsided, but the turmoil inside Bill's heart was far from over. Everything he had known, his life as a small-town sheriff, his bond with Buddy, the simple days that seemed so peaceful, had been a lie. His memories, the ones he had cherished, had been wiped away by forces more powerful than he could have ever imagined. And yet, in the midst of it all, one thing had remained constant. Scout, the German shepherd, standing by his side, was no longer just a dog. He was a symbol of everything Bill had lost and everything he had to gain. Scout had been more than a partner in the field. He had been Bill's protector, his friend, and now, his only connection to the truth. Bill knew now that his fight wasn't just about the past. It was about reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him. It was about bringing down the shadowy organization that had orchestrated the lies. It was about exposing the truth to the world and making sure it never happened again. As the door creaked open and Tom stepped forward, offering his support, Bill felt the first true sense of clarity in months. He had been lost, drifting through a life that wasn't his own, but now he was ready to take on the darkness that had haunted him and to face the truths that had been buried for far too long. "We're not finished yet, Scout," Bill murmured, glancing down at the dog who had never wavered. The dog's steady gaze met his, the unspoken bond between them stronger than any weapon. Together, they had fought for survival, and together, they would take down the enemy. But this time, they weren't running. They were going to make sure that no one else had to suffer the way they had. The journey ahead would be dangerous. There was no doubt about that. The archive would stop at nothing to silence them, to bury the truth. But Bill had something they couldn't take away: his resolve and the trust of a dog who had stood by him through it all. As Bill turned toward the horizon, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice, about righting the wrongs of the past. And with Scout at his side, Bill Turner wasn't going to stop until the truth was set free. With that, Bill's fight to expose the archive and reclaim his life was just beginning. But he had a purpose now, a cause greater than himself. And in the end, that was all he needed. The end, or just the beginning.